Look around for a moment and ask yourself an honest question. Why do the same people keep winning the money game while everyone else seems stuck in the same place year after year? Why is it that no matter how much effort you put in, how many hours you trade for income, or how much stress you carry on your shoulders, the results barely change? At some point, it starts to feel unfair. It begins to look like the system is somehow rigged. But that reaction is already the first misunderstanding, because money does not respond to fairness. It does not respond to effort the way most people believe. Money responds to psychology, and psychology, whether people like it or not, responds to power. Most people never see this clearly. They are too busy reacting to circumstances, too busy trying to survive the month, too busy hoping that if they just keep playing by the rules long enough, eventually things will work out in their favor. But the rules don't bend. Money is not moral. It isn't kind. It doesn't reward good intentions. It flows toward the people who understand how human behavior actually works. Centuries ago, Machiavelli understood this deeply, not because he was obsessed with money, but because he was obsessed with power. And in the modern world, money is simply power wearing a different costume. If you don't understand the psychology behind it, you will spend your entire life chasing the effects instead of the causes. You will keep working harder, saving more, waiting longer, and wondering why nothing truly changes. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people are not poor because they lack intelligence. They're poor because their minds are programmed in the wrong way. They believe money is something you earn, something you deserve, something that arrives as a reward for effort. That belief alone creates a trap. Because the moment you believe money must be earned through effort alone, you accept dependence. Dependence on employers, dependence on systems, dependence on someone else giving you permission. And Machiavelli warned about this exact dynamic. Dependence is weakness, and weakness is always exploited by someone stronger. Look closely at people who stay financially stuck for decades. They usually share the same quiet illusion. They believe the world is fair enough that if they follow the rules, success will eventually appear. They believe visibility comes before power. They believe honesty itself creates leverage. These beliefs feel comforting, and that comfort is exactly what makes them dangerous. Comfort is the enemy of control. The people who build real wealth do not operate from comfort. They operate from clarity. They see something others prefer not to acknowledge. Human beings are predictable. They are emotional, reactive, and often impulsive. And money flows toward those who can predict that behavior, influence it, and position themselves above it. This is where the psychological divide begins. The average person experiences money emotionally. They feel fear when money leaves their account, relief when it arrives, anxiety when income slows down. In other words, money controls their emotional state. But the strategist sees money differently, coldly, almost mechanically. To them, money is movement. It's leverage. It's a signal. They don't ask, "How much did I earn today?" They ask something much more important. Where did control shift? That single difference separates survival from dominance. Most people believe wealth is built by accumulation, saving more, holding more, stacking more. But accumulation without control actually creates fragility. The more tightly you cling to money, the more fearful you become of losing it. And the more fearful you become, the more predictable your behavior becomes. And predictability is a form of poverty. Machiavelli once observed that people quickly forget danger when times are comfortable. Money works in the same way. When people feel safe financially, they relax. They stop paying attention. They stop positioning themselves. They stop preparing for change. Then, when conditions shift, and they always do, they are exposed. This is why sudden wealth disappears so often. Lottery winners, athletes, entrepreneurs who strike it big and then lose everything. The numbers changed, but the psychology never did. The mind stayed poor. Here is something most people never say out loud. Money does not amplify who you are. It reveals who you already were. If someone was impulsive before money, they become reckless with money. If they were fearful before money, they become overly defensive with money. If they were careless before money, they become wasteful with money. Wealth simply removes the filters that used to hide those traits. This is why people who understand money focus on psychology before scale. They train themselves to detach emotionally from the numbers. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop reacting impulsively. When money becomes emotional, decisions shrink into the short term. Everything becomes about immediate relief. But when money becomes neutral, your thinking stretches outward into the future. The average person asks a simple question before making a purchase. Can I afford this? The strategist asks a completely different question. What does this position me for? That shift in thinking changes everything. Most people never ask that second question because they were trained from childhood to think small. They were taught to optimize for comfort, security, and stability. But minimizing risk is not how wealth is built. Minimizing risk is how dependence is maintained. Machiavelli observed that people who avoid risk also avoid power, because power requires exposure, and exposure requires nerve. The psychology of making money begins with a realization most people resist. Safety is not neutral. Safety is a choice, and every choice has consequences. When someone chooses safety above all else, they are trading growth for predictability. They are choosing comfort instead of leverage. Those who choose leverage accept the opposite trade. They give up comfort in exchange for control. There is no third option. This is why so many people stay trapped, even when opportunities exist all around them. They don't see opportunities as opportunities. They see them as threats, as disruptions, as risks to their stability. So they retreat. And retreat is always noticed. Money moves toward expansion, not contraction. It moves toward confidence, not hesitation. This isn't motivational thinking. It's observable behavior. Watch how money behaves in real environments, negotiations, markets, business deals. The person who speaks the least often controls the frame. The person who reacts the slowest often controls the direction. And the person who appears least desperate usually controls the terms. Desperation is visible, and it is punished. This is why Machiavelli emphasized appearance so strongly. Humans respond to what they perceive, not necessarily what is true. If you appear needy, you will be treated as replaceable. If you appear stable, people will test you. If you appear powerful, people will accommodate you. Money follows the same psychology. Most people believe wealth comes from proving their value, from demonstrating how hard they work. But in reality, wealth often comes from positioning value. The worker proves, the strategist positions. One chases approval, the other creates dependence. And that difference quietly determines who stays trapped and who eventually controls the game. Once you begin to see this difference, another uncomfortable realization appears. Working harder rarely produces freedom. It increases output, yes. It might increase income for a while, but it does not automatically increase leverage. And leverage is what ultimately determines who controls the flow of money. Leverage is psychological before it is structural. It begins the moment you stop tying your identity to effort. When you stop advertising how hard you struggle, when you stop explaining every move you make. Silence changes perception. Machiavelli understood something about silence that most people overlook. Silence unsettles people. When someone refuses to immediately explain themselves, others begin filling that space. They reveal information, they offer concessions, they expose their thinking. The same dynamic appears in money decisions. Those who rush reveal weakness. Those who hesitate strategically extract advantage. Waiting is not about laziness or indecision. It is about calculated restraint. The average person spends money to release pressure. They feel stress building inside them, and buying something becomes a quick escape. The strategist does the opposite. They allow pressure to build. Pressure creates movement. Movement creates opportunity. But most people cannot tolerate that discomfort. So they buy quickly, speak quickly, decide quickly. And in doing so, they give up leverage they didn't even realize they had. This is why the psychology of making money often feels unnatural at first. It contradicts social conditioning. It goes against the desire to appear generous, agreeable, and easy to work with. It conflicts with the deep human need to be liked. But wealth has never been built on being liked. It has always been built on being necessary, and necessity is rarely given. It is designed. People who remain financially stuck often believe they are invisible. They feel overlooked by opportunities, ignored by systems, forgotten by the market. But the reality is different. They are not invisible. They are predictable. And predictability is far worse. When your behavior becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. And once it can be controlled, it can be exploited. The wealthy reverse this entire dynamic. They become difficult to read, difficult to pressure, difficult to rush. Unreadability becomes a form of protection. When others cannot easily anticipate your reactions, they are forced to respond to you instead of controlling you. And money naturally moves toward the person controlling the tempo. This is why Machiavellian thinking feels uncomfortable to many people. It strips away comforting illusions. It removes emotional padding and exposes the raw mechanics of human behavior. Money is not distributed based on merit. It moves based on positioning within human systems. Until someone accepts that reality, everything else they do becomes noise. Many people feel resistance when they first encounter this idea. They call it cynical or pessimistic. But the next layer goes even deeper, because it explains something that confuses people everywhere. Why intelligent, disciplined individuals often remain financially stuck, while others rise quickly above them. The answer is identity. Most people grow up with what can be called a worker identity. From childhood, they are trained to follow instructions, complete tasks, and measure their worth through effort. Hard work becomes a moral virtue. Obedience becomes a sign of character. Sacrifice becomes something noble. But money does not reward morality. Money rewards utility. The moment someone defines themselves primarily as a worker, they unknowingly limit their leverage. Workers are interchangeable. Workers are replaceable. Even highly paid workers operate inside someone else's structure. The strategist defines themselves differently. They do not define themselves by output. They define themselves by position. Position determines flow, and flow determines wealth. This is why some individuals earn in a single month what others earn in many years without appearing to work harder. They are not competing on effort. They are operating above the level where effort is the main variable. Most people never look upward to see this. Instead, they look sideways. They compare salaries, job titles, hours worked, promotions, and small differences in income. Meanwhile, the real game is happening vertically, far above the layer they are focused on. Machiavelli warned about this pattern centuries ago. People who obsess over appearances at their own level often miss the forces shaping their fate from above. Money does not circulate evenly. It concentrates, it pools, it moves towards structure. If you are not building structure, you are feeding one. This is why emotional spending is so destructive. When people spend money impulsively, it feels personal, it feels rewarding, it feels like relief. but psychologically it trains the brain to associate money with comfort instead of control, and comfort weakens perception. The more someone seeks immediate relief, the less tolerance they have for delay. The less tolerance they have for delay, the more likely they are to accept bad deals, bad timing, and bad opportunities. Bad terms compound quietly. Machiavelli once observed that people often trade long-term power for short-term peace. That is the psychology of poverty. The wealthy operate in the opposite direction. They accept short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term advantage. They delay gratification not simply because they are disciplined, but because they understand strategy. They recognize something most people never fully grasp. Time itself does not reward patience. Position does. Waiting without leverage leads to stagnation, but waiting with leverage leads to dominance. This is where the predator and prey dynamic appears in financial life. The prey reacts to circumstances. The predator anticipates them. The prey searches for certainty. The predator creates it. The prey constantly explains themselves. The predator allows others to explain themselves. Money flows accordingly. If you watch carefully, you will notice how often people expose themselves without realizing it. They reveal urgency in negotiations. They reveal fear in spending habits. They reveal insecurity in lifestyle choices. And others read those signals immediately. Machiavelli understood that visibility without power becomes vulnerability. In modern terms, this often appears as financial transparency without leverage. People who reveal too much about their situation are quickly priced by others. The wealthy do something different. They cultivate selective opacity. They reveal enough to attract interest, but never enough to lose advantage. This is not secrecy born from paranoia. It is strategic withholding. When information is limited, curiosity increases. Curiosity creates perceived value, and perceived value attracts opportunity. This is why people who constantly talk about money often have the least control over it. They are seeking validation. They want recognition. They want to be seen. The strategist seeks something else entirely: alignment. They place themselves in positions where others must interact with them on favorable terms. This is the core psychological shift. Most people try to be chosen. The wealthy design situations where they become unavoidable. This is not arrogance. It is structure. Designing yourself into leverage requires something most people struggle with: detachment from social approval. It requires accepting that not everyone will understand you, not everyone will agree with you, and not everyone will like your decisions. Machiavelli warned that those who attempt to satisfy everyone eventually satisfy no one. Money punishes people-pleasing behavior. It rewards clarity. Clarity leads to decisive movement, and decisive movement attracts resources. Resources gather around individuals who make decisions quickly and confidently. This is why indecision becomes so expensive over time. Indecision signals weakness. Weakness invites pressure. Pressure forces concessions. And those concessions accumulate quietly year after year. The psychology of making money is not about greed. It is about boundaries. Knowing when to stay silent, knowing when to walk away, knowing when to allow others to overextend themselves. The average person clings desperately to opportunities. The strategist allows opportunities to prove themselves first. Desperation narrows perception. Calm expands it. And the person who remains calm during uncertainty gains access to outcomes that panic causes others to abandon. Machiavelli noted that fortune favors those who act when others freeze. Not because they are fearless, but because they are composed. And composure is not natural. It is cultivated over time. because once someone reframes loss itself, everything changes. Once loss stops looking like failure, something important changes inside your decision-making. Most people fear loss because they see it as something final. To them, losing money means they made a mistake that should have been avoided at all costs. But the strategist sees loss differently. They see it as tuition. Tuition for information, tuition for experience, tuition for understanding where leverage actually exists. This reframing completely transforms how risk is approached. If loss feels terminal, people avoid risk entirely. They protect small certainties and cling to stability even when that stability limits their future. But when loss becomes instructional, risk becomes calculated, and calculated risk is where wealth is born. This explains why so many intelligent people remain financially stuck. Intelligence alone doesn't determine outcomes. In many cases, highly intelligent people become overly cautious. They protect small guarantees instead of pursuing large asymmetries. But money rarely moves in small, balanced steps. It moves asymmetrically, small inputs, large outputs, but only for those positioned correctly. The worker looks for guaranteed returns. The strategist looks for leverage points. And leverage points are uncomfortable places. They involve uncertainty, unfamiliarity, and sometimes temporary instability. This is why most people never approach them. Machiavelli once observed that people cling to the familiar even when the familiar harms them, especially when change threatens their identity, and identity is the real barrier, not information, not intelligence. Identity. If someone sees themselves as cautious, careful, and risk-averse, their behavior will unconsciously align with that identity. Even when logic suggests expansion, behavior always aligns with identity faster than it aligns with logic. That is why the shift from worker to strategist is not cosmetic. It is structural. Once someone stops seeing themselves as a participant in the system and begins seeing themselves as an architect of position, decisions begin to change. Instead of constantly asking, "What should I do next?" they begin asking a different question, "Where should I stand?" Standing in the right position often matters far more than constant movement. Most people exhaust themselves through endless activity while remaining in the wrong position. Movement without leverage is just noise. The wealthy often move less frequently, but when they move, the environment shifts. That is not luck. That is psychology applied consistently over time. The deeper truth is that money does not require constant action. It requires alignment. Alignment between perception, patience, and pressure. When those three elements align, outcomes begin to feel inevitable. This is why people who understand the psychology of money appear calm, while everyone else seems to be scrambling. They are not calmer because they are naturally confident. They are confident because they understand the structure of the game being played. Once you see the game clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. At that point, something subtle begins to change. Not externally, internally. You begin noticing patterns everywhere. You start seeing how often people reveal weakness without realizing it. How quickly they give up leverage in conversations. How often they rush to fill silence. And how consistently money flows toward those who don't. This stage is uncomfortable for many people because awareness creates responsibility. Once you see the patterns, you can no longer blame the system for everything. You can no longer hide behind effort alone. And you can no longer pretend you didn't understand the game. Machiavelli warned that awareness is dangerous, not because it corrupts people, but because it removes excuses. Excuses keep people emotionally comfortable, but comfort rarely creates leverage. The psychology of making money demands emotional discipline, not motivation, not positivity. Discipline. The discipline to delay reactions, the discipline to sit with uncertainty, the discipline to observe instead of immediately responding. The discipline to observe instead of immediately responding. Reaction is expensive. Every reactive decision carries hidden costs, bad timing, missed leverage, unfavorable terms. These costs rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They accumulate quietly over years. This is why many people feel stuck without knowing exactly why. Nothing catastrophic happened. There was no single massive mistake. They simply reacted too often. Machiavelli understood something powerful about how power is lost. Power is rarely lost through explosions. It is lost through small concessions repeated over time. Wealth disappears the same way. The poor rarely collapse overnight. They erode slowly. The wealthy protect themselves from erosion by controlling exposure. And exposure is not the same as visibility. Every time someone reveals dependency, they expose themselves. Every time someone reveals fear, they expose themselves. The strategist reduces exposure by structuring situations where others move first. Whoever moves first reveals information, and whoever reveals information first often loses leverage. This principle applies everywhere. Negotiations, investments, career decisions, even everyday purchases. The person who must buy immediately loses bargaining power. The person who can wait controls the price. Time only becomes leverage when you are not desperate. Desperation collapses time. That is why living financially on the edge is so dangerous. When someone is constantly under financial pressure, they are forced to move quickly, and speed under pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes compound. The wealthy intentionally build slack into their lives, not laziness. Slack. Slack creates optionality, and optionality is power. When you have options, you are no longer negotiating for survival. You are negotiating for advantage. Most people never experience this shift. They live inside tight margins financially and emotionally. Tight margins force compliance. Machiavelli observed that those without resources eventually submit to those who possess them. This principle has not changed. Money is one resource. Psychological composure is another. People who possess both rarely lose. This is why impulse spending is not really about desire. It is about emotional leakage. Buying becomes a release valve for stress. The strategist recognizes this pattern and avoids becoming predictable to marketers, trends, or systems designed to exploit impatience. Trends exist to harvest urgency. The herd rushes in. The strategist waits. Not forever, just long enough. Long enough to see who is panicking. Long enough to see who is bluffing. Long enough to see where fear has created mispricing. Fear always creates opportunity, but only for those who are not consumed by it. This is why downturns often redistribute wealth, not because the wealthy are lucky, but because they remain solvent and composed, while others collapse emotionally. Emotion usually comes before liquidation. People sell at the worst possible moments, not because they must, but because they cannot tolerate uncertainty. Tolerance for uncertainty is one of the most valuable financial skills a person can develop. Machiavelli called this fortitude, the ability to withstand pressure without deforming. When people deform under pressure, they reveal their limits. Markets test limits, negotiations test limits, life tests limits. And the psychology of making money ultimately becomes the psychology of maintaining form under stress. Most people lose that form quickly. They rationalize, they justify, they compromise, and every compromise moves them further away from leverage. The strategist observes these behaviors in others and learns from them. They watch who breaks first, who talks too much, who gives ground too early. And they remember, because memory is power. Those who forget patterns repeat losses. Those who remember patterns avoid them. This is the final layer most people never reach. Understanding that money is not something you chase, It is something that moves toward clarity, restraint, and control. Those qualities repel chaos, and chaos is where most people live. They chase excitement, validation, and fast results. But fast results are unstable. Stability comes from boring decisions, repeated consistently over time. Machiavelli admired rulers who appeared dull to their enemies. Because boredom hides preparation. The same is true with wealth. Those who quietly build systems often appear unremarkable. But behind that calm exterior, leverage is accumulating, and by the time others notice, the position is already untouchable.